My name is Rebecca. I'm 32 years old, and for the last decade, I had been financing my parents' retirement while they told me I wasn't doing enough. I was lying on my back in a surgical gown, my IV already in, waiting for a laparoscopic procedure to remove fibroids. The anesthesiologist had just walked through the pre-op checklist. My phone buzzed. It was my mother, Margaret, calling from her home in Portland. I wasn't supposed to answer. I was minutes away from going under, but I did. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She asked if I could still send them $5,000 for their property tax. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, my heart rate accelerating on the monitor, and realizing I couldn't remember the last time my mother had called me without wanting something. So let me back up and tell you how we got here. I grew up as the middle child in a household where money was always tight, but love was supposed to make up for it. My parents, Margaret and Dennis, had 3 kids. My older brother moved to Seattle and went radio silent years ago. My younger sister lives in New York and, smart woman, maintains what she calls healthy distance. I was the one who stayed close. I was the one who called every Sunday. I was the one who said yes. By the time I was 25, I had a degree in financial analysis and a solid job at a mid-sized investment firm in Portland. Good salary, good benefits, real career trajectory. My parents had retired early enough that they hadn't really planned for it properly. Dennis had taken a buyout from his manufacturing job, and Margaret had left her administrative role because she said she deserved to rest. They were in their early 60s, no savings buffer, living in the house they'd owned since I was born. That's when the calls started coming differently. At first it was small. Could I help with the property tax? Just this once. $1,000. I could afford it. I sent it. Then it was the hot water heater. Then the roof inspection revealed damage. My parents never directly asked. That wasn't their style. They mentioned the problem, sighed about the cost, and then there was silence on the phone that somehow felt heavier than any request could have been. I filled that silence with money. Every few months, a new crisis. A medical bill that insurance didn't cover. A car repair. Rising utility costs. Property taxes again. And every time I sent money, I felt 2 things at once. Guilty for not sending more and resentful that I was sending anything at all. But I never said no. I told myself it was duty. Family. My parents had raised me, and now it was my turn to take care of them. For context, my salary was good, but it wasn't unlimited. I was renting a 1-bedroom apartment. I had student loans. I had been thinking about buying property, about building something that was actually mine. But every time I checked my savings account, there was another reason to move money to my parents' account instead. My therapist, who I started seeing at 28, pointed out something I wasn't ready to hear. I wasn't helping my parents become independent. I was making myself responsible for their choices. She asked me to do something simple. She asked me to keep a list of every request they made and every check I sent. For 3 months. At the end of those 3 months, I had written down 19 transfers. An average of $1,000 every 10 days. Some months it was more. I had given them nearly $6,000 in a single quarter, and I hadn't told anyone because I felt ashamed. Not of them, of myself. I started researching what my parents actually needed to live. What I found was that their house was paid off. Their property taxes weren't anywhere near as dire as they claimed, and they both qualified for Medicare and Social Security. They weren't in actual crisis. They were in a lifestyle maintenance problem, and I was the solution they had found. The next Sunday call, I prepared myself. I was going to say no. I was going to set a boundary. I practiced in my apartment for 20 minutes, standing in front of my bathroom mirror like an idiot. I was going to tell them gently, but firmly, that I couldn't keep doing this. Then my mother called first before I could reach them, and she told me she'd been to the doctor. She had a thyroid condition that wasn't serious, but needed monitoring. My father came on the extension and said how worried they were, how they didn't want to be a burden, and I melted. I sent another $1,500. This pattern continued for 5 more years. By 31, I had saved enough for a modest down payment on a small condo. Not much, $40,000, but it represented actual sacrifice. I had stopped going out with colleagues. I had cut my spending to almost nothing. I had said no to vacations, to new clothes, to anything that felt frivolous, And for the first time in a decade, I had money that was entirely mine for something that was entirely mine. I found the condo in Northeast Portland. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, south-facing windows. It needed work, but the bones were good. I could see myself there. I made an offer. It was accepted. The down payment was scheduled to close in 6 weeks. I didn't tell my parents. Not because I was keeping a secret, but because I needed to protect something. I needed to protect my own future from being absorbed into their crisis management. I told myself it was temporary. Once the house closed, I would tell them. Once I had the deed in my name, once it was real and legally mine, then I would mention it. The night before my surgery, I had dinner with my mother. I had mentioned the fibroids casually weeks before, and she had offered to come with me to the hospital. I said no. It was outpatient. I'd be fine. She seemed hurt that I didn't want her there. But the truth was, I didn't want her there. I wanted to go through something hard and come out on the other side without having to manage her emotions about my own pain. Surgery was scheduled for 8 in the morning. I was at the hospital by 6:30. My surgeon walked me through the risks and the procedure one more time. Fibroids were benign. The surgery was routine. I might feel some cramping after, some spotting. I'd be able to drive home by evening. Normal activity in a week. I changed into the gown. The nurses got my IV in. Everything moved fast once you were past the waiting room. A nurse checked my emergency contact. I had listed my sister in New York, not my parents. The nurse raised her eyebrows but didn't comment. I was wheeled toward the operating room. The anesthesiologist reviewed my medications one final time. I was starting to feel the first edges of the sedative, that floating sensation, when my phone buzzed again on the pre-op table where they'd let me keep it for 5 more minutes. It was my mother. The call went to voicemail because my hands were already getting heavy, but I could read the preview of her message in the notification. "Hi, honey, just checking in. Also, we had to get the deck stained, and it was more expensive than expected. Can you help? We need $5,000. Call me when you wake up." I didn't listen to the full voicemail until I was in recovery. Still groggy, my mouth dry, a heating pad across my lower abdomen. The world still soft around the edges. That's when something broke open inside me. Not dramatically. There was no crying, no rage. Just a sudden, crystalline understanding that I had already lost enough to this pattern, and I would not lose one more day. My surgeon came to check on me after an hour. No complications. Everything went well. I asked her how soon I could do strenuous activity. She said take it easy for a week, but most patients felt pretty normal in a few days. I nodded and thought about what I was about to do. My mother called back an hour later while I was still at the facility, waiting for my discharge paperwork. I answered. She asked immediately about the $5,000. I told her I needed to focus on my recovery and hung up. No explanation. No softness. Just a quiet no. The weeks between surgery and closing were the strangest weeks of my life. I went to work. I recovered. The cramping faded. I got my energy back. And I didn't answer calls from my parents unless they came through my work emergency contact line, which they never did. My therapist asked me what I was doing. I told her I was changing one thing, not my job, not my location. One thing. I was going to stop giving my parents money, completely, permanently, no more transfers, no more emergencies, no more conversations that ended with me writing a check. She asked how I would tell them. I said I wasn't going to tell them. I was just going to stop. When they called asking, I would say no. Clearly, simply no. And if they pushed, the answer was still no. If they threatened to cut me off, the answer would still be no. Because the terrible truth I had been avoiding was that I couldn't cut them off any more than I already was. My coworker, James, noticed I seemed lighter those weeks. I didn't offer context, but I told him I was buying a condo. He asked when I'd be moving. I said after closing, which was in 2 weeks. I hadn't told my parents about the condo yet. Closing happened on a Tuesday. I signed papers. I got the deed. The keys were handed to me by the realtor, a woman named Susan, who congratulated me on taking a huge step. I drove straight to the property. It was mine. The small kitchen, the south-facing windows, the original hardwood floors that would need refinishing, all of it was legally, completely, unquestionably mine. That evening, I called my parents. My mother answered. I could hear the television in the background, some news program Dennis was watching. I told them I had bought a condo. I would be moving within the month. I told them the address. I told them I would visit, that I still cared about them, but I was not going to send them money anymore. Not for property taxes, not for repairs, not for emergencies that weren't true emergencies. They qualified for Social Security and Medicare. They owned a paid-off house. They were going to have to make a budget, prioritize expenses, or sell the house if they couldn't afford to live in it. But that was not my responsibility. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How can you do this to us?" I said, "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm doing this for me." Dennis got on the phone. He was calmer than my mother, but also sharper. He said if I wasn't going to help, they would have to reduce contact. He said I was being cruel. He said I was ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. I listened. I didn't argue. When he finished, I said, "I understand this is hard. I hope you find a way forward, but I can't be the person who solves this anymore." I hung up. My sister called me 2 days later. My mother had called her upset. My sister said, "Good for you," and meant it. She said she'd set a boundary like that 5 years ago, and it was the best decision she'd made. She asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes. We made plans for the following weekend. My mother tried calling me for a month straight. I didn't answer. She left voicemails that started angry, moved into confused, and eventually landed on manipulative, talking about her health, about being lonely, about how I had always been her favorite, and this betrayal was breaking her heart. I didn't listen to all of them. I saved them, though, because my therapist wanted me to hear them, to remember what happened when I said no. 3 months after I moved into my condo, my parents sold the house. They bought a smaller property outside Portland, something they could actually afford. My mother called to tell me, almost conversationally, as if the previous months hadn't happened. She asked if I wanted to come see it. I said I'd think about it. A year later, I did visit. The new place was modest but clean. My parents seemed older. My mother didn't ask me for money. We had tea in the kitchen, and she talked about the garden she was planting. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in years. Looking back, that's what I understand now. I had spent a decade thinking that the price of family was financial self-sacrifice. I thought love was supposed to cost me everything I wanted. But the thing about that kind of thinking is, it doesn't actually make anyone happier. My parents weren't grateful for my money. They just wanted more. And I wasn't happy. I was just smaller and smaller, year after year, until I was barely present at my own life. The one thing I changed was my answer. I stopped saying yes to things that were slowly destroying me. I stopped managing other people's choices by subsidizing them. I stopped confusing guilt with love. That condo, with its south-facing windows and original hardwood floors, taught me something I wish I'd known before I paid for a decade of other people's decisions. Your own life is not selfish. It is the only life you actually have. A few people have asked me over time what ultimately happened with my relationship with my parents. We're in contact now, carefully. My mother still hints sometimes that something is expensive, and I still say I can't help. My father and I talk about neutral topics: the weather, his tomato plants, books we've read. It's not warm, but it's stable. They learned I meant what I said, and I learned that I could survive their disappointment. That was the real closing, the one that mattered. So tell me, have you ever had to choose between being helpful and being whole? Have you been caught in a pattern where your generosity was actually enabling someone else's avoidance? I want to hear about it. Drop your story in the comments. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe. Women Drama Stories covers every kind of hard choice a woman can make, and you do not want to miss what comes next. This story is a work of fiction, created for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental.